lens that we take on as Christians is through what the Bible says. And so part of this conversation that we're beginning here is taking the first steps in saying, this is not just what my parents believe, but this is what I believe. It's not just my parents' faith that I've inherited, but these are the truths that I hold to be true. These are the things that I say are true. And so as you go through these topics, I want you to ask yourself, are these the things that I say I believe or just the things that I've been told I believe? Because if we can get you to that next step, that's going to be really exciting. And then whenever you're engaging with the world that has all these other things they want to say, you'll kind of be able to hold strong to these things which you hold to be true. I mean, think about this game that we just played, right? All of you guys were working together to try, I hope, you boys, maybe you were a lost cause, but you were working together to try to figure out what it was that was being the truth that was up there on that board, right? But that's not how simple it is in the world, because a lot of times there are going to be people that try to distract you and say different things about what is true out there, right? Imagine playing this game. It was hard, right? It was a bit of a hard game. Some of them were pretty easy, right? Not for the girls. But imagine playing that game if 90% of the people that you were trying to read the charades of were trying to tell you something different than was actually on the thing. That would be pretty much impossible, right? But that's what we have to go up against whenever we go out into the world, because 90% or more, probably more like 99.999% of people are going to be trying to tell us things that are just not true whenever we go outside of reading the scriptures that we hold to be God's word. And so we're going to go into that today. We're going to be talking about it, and we're going to see what God has for us to learn and live out in our lives. And so last year we kind of started this journey with Preteen Passage. We talked about a lot of different topics. Actually, in fact, there's something we did really similar to this just about a month ago. We talked about purity, holiness, and biblical sexuality with the students. And we last year talked about, with our Preteen Passage, which was online, we talked about who is God. We talked about how we know God through the scriptures and revelation. We talked about who we are, our identity. And we also talked about what is wrong with the world. And tonight what I want to do is I want to focus on that final aspect where we kind of led up to at the very end. Just a really quick, brief recap. We confess that God is all good, all powerful, wonderful, and perfect, and he's a judge and ruler over all of us. He created us so that we would be able to have right relationship with him, that our purpose would be to glorify him and to enjoy him forever. But through sin, which crept into our hearts, we actually severed that relationship with God, and that is why we see so much brokenness in the world today. And so right now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on what we do with that broken world we find ourselves in, okay? We may say we're redeemed people, but how do we live as redeemed people in a broken world? Well, one of the things we know is that God promises there will be one who will save us from this brokenness. And so the big question I want you to ask today, and this is what we're going to be tackling this entire time we're together, is this question: who's going to save us from our brokenness? If you want to write that at the very top of your paper, you can. That's the topic of our conversation today. And so, by the way, does anyone have an idea of who that person may be? Jesus, yeah, the Sunday school answer. The Sunday school answer, I mean, sometimes it's the right one. Jesus, right? But Jesus didn't just come on the scene out of nowhere. We got to talk about where Jesus came from. What was the point of Jesus? What did he come to do? Do we know about him before he came in Matthew 1? We're going to find out about that today. And so to start out, what I want to do is I want to teach you guys a word, okay? The word is called righteousness. Can everyone say righteousness? Righteousness. What righteousness is it's having a right relationship with God. And so when we were created, we had a right relationship with God. But that's something we lost, right? So raise your hand if you've been in a relationship or friendship with someone, and because something one of you did, you had to end the friendship. I'm pretty sure everyone's hands should be up right now. Who has not had a broken relationship at some point, friendship, anything? right? It's really easy. And that's kind of what happened with us and God is we were created perfect and we had a perfect relationship with him, but through our sinful actions, which we're going to be talking about today, we severed that. We severed that, and now we live in all this brokenness. And so what we call brokenness now is actually that broken relationship. We don't have God to protect us in the same way that he did before. We don't have the garden, for instance, right? Whenever Adam and Eve created, they had the garden. We don't have the garden. We talk about our lives, and this is a depressing beginning, by the way, so that we can actually get somewhere really exciting later. But what happens whenever we fell in this way, because we all talk about the fall, right? Whenever we fell this way, we become dead. We become dead in our sins and our trespasses, and we actually become enemies of God. Everyone say enemies of God. That's what you are because of your sinful nature. And not any one of us is exempt from that, right? So whenever I say that, I am also an enemy of God aside from God's grace. Okay? That's just who I am, and I can't help that because that's who I am. I sin because I'm a sinner, and I'm a sinner because I sin. You see, it works both ways. And so oftentimes, whenever we recognize this kind of truth that this is our identity, this is our sin nature, we try a bunch of different stuff in order to distract us from it or try to fill the void, somehow fix that brokenness, right? And so what are the things you see out there in the world, it can be Christian or otherwise, that you see people striving to get? Think about that for a second. What do people want in life? Money. I heard money. Shout it out. Money, power. What else? What's that over there? Love, right? You want good relationships. Josh, you're the love man. You're here to share love with everyone. I don't mean to make you feel bad. What else, though? What else? Rosalie, what'd you say? Acceptance. That's a good one, right? We want to feel like we're a part of community. What else? Happiness. And so there's a lot of ways you can go after happiness. A lot of the things that we already talked about. Love, acceptance, wealth, power. All those things are kind of things that make us happy, right? Maybe you pursue pleasure. And so there's a lot of things you like to do, whether it be sports, video games, food, drink, whatever, right? But we're striving after a lot of these things. And these things aren't necessarily bad things, right? All these things we want to do aren't bad things, but they are means that we use to often escape the reality of our brokenness, right? They're things that God has given us as gifts, but they're not necessarily remedies for our situation, okay? The truth is that nothing we do can actually save us from where we're at there. What God says, what Jesus says, is that the standard to be saved, to actually be brought back into the word that we talked about, righteousness, is to be perfect, right? But there's a problem with that, right? Because are we perfect? No, none of us are perfect, right? We all mess up, we all sin, we all break things. And once you've kind of trespassed on perfection, there's not really any like reeling back on that, right? If you've stained a white mattress or white carpet, whatever, you know, it's pretty difficult to get the stain out. It's already stained. And that's kind of what our relationship is with God. And so I want to lay out this really clear picture that we actually have a hopeless situation right now. We don't have any way to save ourselves. All we have is this, you know, all this stuff to fill the void, you know, the video games, the pleasure, the acceptance, the love, all the things we seek after. And those things are good, but they don't fill up that void. And so, what? You know, so what? That's the brokenness we live in. Do we just continue to live however we want and then face God at the end and be like, all right, bring on your wrath? Is that a good way to live? No, right? Luckily, the situation actually isn't totally hopeless, okay? The situation isn't totally hopeless because God actually promises we can be saved from all of his wrath, okay? So on our own, there's no way to save ourselves. No matter what we seek after, whether it's love, happiness, doing good things, none of that's going to fix us. But God does give a way for us to be fixed. And so I want us to all go ahead and turn over to Genesis 3, if we can. Now, if I asked you when you thought the very first, I guess, talk about the good news, the gospel was, what book of the Bible would you guess? Genesis. I think I might have spoiled it by telling you to turn over to Genesis. I'm not going to lie. But actually, what we find, Bella's right. It's Genesis, where Genesis chapter 3 is where we very first hear about the good news that we're going to receive from God, okay? And so let me just tell you a story. It's going to sound like a familiar story, but I want you to go along with me, okay? Adam and Eve are created. They're in a garden. It's really nice. It's everything it's supposed to be, okay? But there's one itsy-bitsy little thing that gets on their nerves. There's this tree that God tells them, and he says that if you eat from this tree, you'll die, right? It's dangerous. Do not eat from the tree. And so that's a pretty good deal. You get to live in paradise and, just don't eat the tree, and then you're all hunky-dory. But what happens is there's actually a snake, a serpent that comes up, and he tells Adam and Eve, well, he wasn't totally honest about everything that tree has to offer. You see, if you actually consume of that tree, you're going to become like God. You're not going to die. You're going to become like God. And what happens is Adam and Eve eventually go ahead and eat from the tree. They believe the serpent instead of God. And what happens is that from eating that tree, all the evil, all the sin comes into the world that has destroyed it and made it broken, right? So we have to understand all the brokenness we see around us, right? From the natural disasters to the evil in men's hearts, all the terrorism that we see today, anything, right? All of that stems from the brokenness that we have inherited from Adam and Eve. And we were, in some sense, right there with them in their sins, okay? We've all committed that sin together, okay? And so what happens is that as God is cursing them, cursing both the snake and them, he actually does something interesting, though. Aside from just cursing them, he actually makes them a promise. He looks over to the serpent and he looks over at Adam and Eve, and he says, someone go ahead and read. Would someone want to read in the mic, actually? Is anyone that brave? Oh, okay. I'm going to say Alyssa, yeah. Do you want to read Genesis chapter 3, verse 15?
Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild. Wait, that's not the right verse.
Verse 15.
Oops. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel.
Okay, great. So he makes this promise. God makes this promise in the middle of all this evil that's happened, the brokenness that Adam and Eve with Satan have unleashed onto the world. He makes this promise, and he says that your seed, serpent, and your seed, Eve, will have a battle. And your seed, your offspring, a descendant of you, Eve, is going to remain victorious over this serpent. He will crush the serpent's head, but the serpent is going to strike his heel. Okay? And this snake, this serpent, he's the source of the evil that we see in the world around us, right? He's the one who brought evil into the garden. He brought the sin. But there's this weird thing where the serpent's also, during the battle, going to strike him, okay? And so right here is where we see this figure, right, this messianic figure, and this person is called the Anointed One. Everyone say Anointed One. That's what Messiah means. Raise your hand if you've heard the word Messiah. So Messiah is basically the Hebrew word which we have for Christ. So Christ is the Greek version of the Hebrew word Messiah. And Messiah just means anointed one. This is the one who's going to come, and he's going to actually reign over the world. We're going to see how he's a great king, and he's actually going to crush the head of the serpent, defeating death for all time. And so as you go into your small groups now, which I'm going to throw you into, we're just around your tables, I want you to discuss maybe a few things we talked about and go through that list of questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. So go ahead, adults, if you want to take the lead, that would be incredible. Students, if you want to take the lead, that'd also be incredible. But you'll have about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to go ahead and work through some of those questions and have some conversations. All right, go ahead and take about 2 more minutes to wrap up your conversations. All right. Well, I hope you guys had some good conversations. I am curious to hear what some of you guys came up with. Did we have any like really good pet peeves in any circles? Jordan, you want to share one? Slow walkers. Like whenever you're walking right behind them in a close corridor. Robert? Losing. Josh? Ooh, when people don't know how to stop talking at school. Any others? Math. That's a good one. Gabby, did you have one? What? When people smack in your ear? Like intentionally, or they're just like eating really loudly? Yeah. Seth. Your brother. What? Misogyny. Oh, misogyny. I thought you were talking like some weird type of massage. Yeah, misogyny is pretty annoying. Dominic. Bella, do you have a counterattack? Yeah? Ooh, that's a good one. All right, final one. Alyssa, you got one? Yeah. That's my nervous tick. If I ever get nervous, I'm going to start laying on the uhs. The uhs or the ums. That's my nervous one. Any other good answers for some of the questions that we talked about that anyone would like to share? Bella? Right. Very good. Very good. Seth, did you have a thought? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And two, whenever we start comparing ourselves to the people around us, it's pretty easy to think about ourselves as being good. Would you guys agree? Yeah, because you can compare yourself to Hitler. And if I'm comparing myself to Hitler, I'm winning that battle every single day, right? But the problem is that we're not supposed to compare ourselves to other broken people, right? We talked about brokenness. The problem is that we have to compare ourselves to God, and his standards a whole lot more than what we can handle. So whenever we start looking at ourselves compared to him, are we really good people? No, it exposes all of our evil ways, our sin, our brokenness. Lincoln, I saw your hand. Yeah. It's hard to even compare because he's just perfect and we're so imperfect. Any other thoughts? I'm not sure if you guys got to some of the later questions. No, we all got to the first three about? Okay. Any thoughts to the final couple of questions? Let me ask you this. Is it intimidating to think God's requirement is perfection? Yeah, right. Because, like we said, what's the problem with that? Yeah, we're not going to be perfect, right? We don't have that ability. So, Bella, you're ahead of the game. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. And we talked about this, but is there any way that we can save ourselves? No. Big fat no. So we laid out this story. We talked about how there's this figure, this guy who's going to go ahead and crush the head of the serpent. His heel is going to be struck, but he's going to crush the head of the serpent, and he's going to defeat death. He's going to defeat evil forever, right? And for a little while, we don't know much more about this person. It's in Genesis 3, so it's a pretty early picture of the gospel message, the good news we're going to learn about. But it's not until a little bit ways later that we discover more about this person. And so we meet this guy named Abraham. Raise your hand if you ever heard of Abraham before, right? And what happened with Abraham? God made a covenant with Abraham, basically a promise, saying, Abraham, I'm going to, from you, make a great nation full of so many blessings that will bless the entire world. And so we get down from Abraham and we come to one of his descendants, a guy named Judah, and he receives a promise that a great king will come from him, this same character, and the whole world is going to follow this king, and he's going to bring all these incredible blessings with him. And then, naturally, the first king we meet from the line of Judah is a guy named King David. Have you ever heard of King David before? He was a pretty good king if we're comparing David to other people, right? But compared to God, what ended up happening was he wasn't actually that great of a king. The problem was we had this kind of question like, is this the king? Is this the great king that everyone's going to be talking about, that we've been talking about, the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent? And in the end, we find out, no, that's not who he is. In the end, he actually, just like each of us, succumbed to sin, succumbed to evil. And in fact, he at times has actively chosen evil. And he was still a good king. We got the Psalms, But compared to God, he didn't reach that standard. And so it was revealed that that's not the king we're talking about. And so maybe we start thinking, okay, if it wasn't King David, who's it going to be? And luckily, God actually gives a promise. He says, from you, David, I will bring forth this great king. So we know it will be from his line. And so we look at David's sons, hoping that maybe this figure, this messianic figure, this Messiah is going to come from him, the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent. And kerplunk, none of them fit the bill. Actually, they get a whole lot worse and worse and worse until the entire nation of Israel collapses, right? The entire nation of Israel collapses. There's no more kings. And so for a lot of people, they're even asking the question like, hey, is this promise thing still on? Like, if there's not going to be another king, then how are we going to get this guy who's going to defeat evil for all time? How are we going to find him? And during these dark times is when God gives some prophets, some messengers of God who are going to continue to tell Israel, God's chosen people, that the king is still coming to defeat evil, and they tell us a little bit more about him. And so for this next little bit, before we go back into small groups, I'm going to look at one particular one of these prophets, a guy named Isaiah, okay? Can everyone say Isaiah really quick? Isaiah is a great guy to look at if you want to understand the Messiah that's coming. And we're going to look at two texts from him. Let's go ahead, all turn to Isaiah 9, verse 6. Do we have someone that would like to read that little verse? Bella, we skipped you last time.
For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and a government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
Okay, so we learn a little bit more information about this figure, whoever he is, right? Wonderful Counselor. What else does it say? Prince of Peace. Eternal Father. There's one more, I think. Mighty God. Okay, we're learning a little bit more about who this figure is. I think Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, those are really interesting things to dive into. But the one thing I actually really want to dive into here is that final one about how he's called the Prince of Peace, right? Because thinking of him as a king, what it's talking about is that his reign as king is going to bring about the kind of peace that would not happen without him. So with him, there will be peace. Without him, there cannot be any peace. Whoever this person is, he's going to bring both peace to man for man, and he's going to bring peace to man with God. So both with man and God, peace will be made. There's going to be reconciliation there. And as we have peace, we have to ask ourselves the question, what does that word peace mean, right? And so similar back to going to righteousness, if righteousness is what? Right relationship with God, then peace is right relationship with everyone else, including God, right? If we have peace with our neighbors, if we have peace with God, that's the kind of righteousness that we're talking about with them. It's about being in right relationship with them. But being in right relationship with other people isn't always easy. Do you guys recognize that? Yeah, sometimes it's pretty hard. And so if this Prince of Peace delivers us into peace, one thing that we really have to understand is that if we have that kind of life now, that doesn't guarantee that things get really easy, okay? In fact, sometimes it's going to give us a lot of opportunities for sacrifice and hardship in order to maintain that peace and live that peace out. So that's important to know. So this Messiah that's going to come, he doesn't promise easy lives, but he does promise peace, which is better. Okay, there's one final text I want to look at, and this is actually going to expose, we're going to discover together what this striking of the Messiah is, this coming one, this anointed one, what his heel is going to look like after it's struck. Struck. We're going to go ahead and read Isaiah 52, verses 13, and all of Isaiah 53. We're going to read this together, and then as you're reading, I'm going to read this one out loud, but as we're reading, I want you to pay some special attention to this because we'll be talking about it in our small groups in just 1 second. Okay, so I'm starting from verse 13 of 52 here. I'll give you a second to get there. Isaiah 52, verse 13, and then all of chapter 53. It says this, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, but he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. So there's a lot there, right? There's a lot there. I think some of it's going to sound pretty familiar, some of it's going to sound pretty new, but this is what the reality of this figure, this Messiah, is going to look like, that is coming, that God has promised is going to crush the head of the serpent. But this is what it looks like when the serpent bites his heel. He will be crushed, right? He will be crushed for the sake of others. And I really want to point out what it says at the very end, because we're talking about one word, righteousness. It says at the very end, out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. This is verse 11. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. So because of his righteousness, his right relationship with God, many will be brought into having that right relationship of God. And if we understand what that means that those people will be declared perfect. Because if perfection is the standard, right, and we have all these blemishes on us that make us imperfect, what this means is that those blemishes will be taken away from us. And that's what it talks about. In verse 12, it talks about how he's bearing the sin. He's taking on the sin of many. He's making intercession for them. Intercession just meaning kind of the middleman, the guy who's, if you're having a little squabble with a friend, right, and you say, hey, can you tell Jessica I'm really sorry about pulling her pigtails? That would be really nice. Jessica's your intercessor, right? In the same way, whoever this figure is an intercessor for us for all of our transgressions against God. He's the person who's coming in between us so that we might all have right relationship together. There's a lot more in this passage that I think we should all talk about, but this is an important, probably the most important thing we need to understand about this figure who's coming into the world, who's going to make us actually have the opportunity for hope, so that it's not so hopeless like we talked about at the very, very beginning, okay? Because we can't save ourselves, but this person, it looks like, certainly can. So go ahead and take about 10 minutes going back around your table and just go through some of those questions. And in about 10 minutes, maybe 7:30-ish, 7:35-ish, we can talk a little bit about your answers. Take about one more minute to wrap up your conversations, and then we'll close pretty soon. Okay, all right. Well, I'm curious the conversations you guys have been having. Anyone want to share anything interesting someone in your groups have shared? Doesn't have to be your own thought. If you want to call out someone else, they said something absolutely unbelievable. You got one, Coco? It's all about the what? Yeah. Right. I like what you said, Coco. Coco said, looking at the final question, what kind of person would it take to suffer like this for others? She said, no one. No one I know, right? There's no person that would be willing to suffer like this because we're all selfish. We kind of live in a selfish world. That's kind of part of our brokenness. That was a really good thought, Coco. Bella? It's sometimes not fair, and it sometimes costs going out of your comfort zone. That's good. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Did anyone have a particularly juicy story from the first one? Don't call anyone out, but... Okay. I had a feeling whenever you raised your hand. Him. I was looking for like a funny story, though. Not just like, I despise everything about this person. All right, I want to hear from Norbert.
27 different people from school.
27, dude. Once you're making a list, that's probably not healthy. Alyssa, your history teacher. I think we all can pick on the teachers. They're just trying their best, though. Maybe, not all the time. Any other answers to some of the other questions? Maybe what would it mean to have peace with someone instead of enmity? Yes. Your mom would have peace and quiet. Is that something she asks for a lot? No. Bella? Uh-huh.
I ran away, and she came and she was like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, how dare you? And I was being so dramatic. But then she was like, I'm never talking to you again. And so she never talked to me again.
Yeah. You did it the classy way, though. You left the name anonymous.
Yeah.
That's good. True. Okay. Patricia. Oh, Patricia. Gertrude. Oh. Okay. Any other final thoughts about something you guys discussed in your your conversations? Any parts of Isaiah 53 that particularly stuck out with you? Maybe a particular line, aspect of it? Robert? Yeah. Yeah. What kind of love does that take, right? That's insane. Any other thoughts? Well, okay, what I want to do next is I want to talk about specifically what the Bible in the Old Testament does. Because you might notice we haven't really hit anything in the New Testament. And so one of the things I'm wanting you guys to understand is how you're supposed to read something like the Old Testament, right? Can you see the Messiah, who we're going to talk about, who shows up in the New Testament, but can we see the Messiah in the Old Testament and seeing that it's all working toward revealing him in some sense, right? And that's what I want to look at. I hope we maybe covered a little aspect of that today, about how we see him come up in Genesis, how we see him come up in Isaiah, whenever we look at some of the storylines in the Bible through King David and the prophets, all of that stuff. We can actually look at topics that don't necessarily on the surface look like they have anything to do with Messiah, but then eventually, once we do read the New Testament, see that there's something being fulfilled there which we wouldn't have known apart from him. And so if we see manna, bread raining from heaven in the Old Testament, and then we look at in the New Testament, whenever the Messiah talks about himself being the bread of life, that you would not have to eat again after consuming, then we actually are able to kind of see little aspects of him throughout all of the Bible. And so I want to play a video really quick that's going to talk about how we're to read the Old Testament with this view in mind.
Are virtually every biblical figure but one? It's almost important to remember that the Old Testament is an Eastern book more than it is a Western book. It's not just dealing linear, going A, B, C, D. Rather, who Christ is, what he must do, is being defined by what he is not in the Old Testament. And you take a figure like Samson in the Bible. There was a man who had great strength and great cleverness. And if you know the story, when Samson had long hair, he was strong. When he had short hair, he was weak. Now, what's the message there? Well, it's obvious we should have long hair, so then we'll be strong. Well, no, that's not the message. The message was, no matter how strong or clever you are not your own Savior. You are not your own Redeemer. That's a dead end if you're going to depend on your own strength and your own wisdom. Think about the way an Eastern thinker sometimes represents truth is not saying this thought leads to that thought leads to that thought, but rather speaking around a truth so that you get the truth. The people of God are given the law, but they break the law. Sacrifices are provided, but the priests who begin to offer them become themselves malevolent and not helping. Then the judges say, well, just do what's right in your own eyes. That doesn't work. All right, pick a king. You're tallest, strongest, handsomest guy. Well, that king becomes selfish. Well, we'll get the prophets to the kings, and the kings will learn what to do from the prophets. Sounds great, except the people kill the prophets. And you begin to understand that through the course of millennia, God is saying, we need a better lawkeeper. We need a better judge, better sacrifice, better prophet, better priest, better king. Not this, not this, not this, not this, not this, but this.
So whenever we look at the end in mind, right, we look at the Messiah that we see all the way back from Genesis 3 about his coming, we're able to actually recognize aspects that are being fulfilled in him whenever we finally discover who that is in the New Testament, right? And, we're dancing around at Jesus, obviously. We talk about Jesus, we talk about the cross and what that accomplished, and we talk about how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. He fulfilled the law, and there's many, many senses beyond just the law that he fulfilled the Old Testament. We see all these glimpses. If you look at the binding of Isaac, if you look at the Israelites in the wilderness, if you look at all these different things that are happening, the law, the sacrifices, the priests, the kings, the prophets, all of them are little glimpses of who this ultimate figure is that's coming into the world, okay? And so Jesus doesn't just exist. He just doesn't pop into being in 2 BC or whenever he was born, he was being talked about all this time. And that's the good news we have, is that we've been talking about this in the future tense, right? Where we say, this Messiah is coming. He's coming. This is what he's going to look like, all of that. But the good news is that we actually recognize he's already come, right? He's already come. He's given us a chance at new life. And so next week, next Wednesday, we're going to talk about who this guy is, what his character is, what he came to accomplish, and what he achieved for us. We've learned a lot about him today, but we're going to be a little bit more direct and fill in maybe the other pieces of the picture that we haven't talked about. But really quick, I want you guys to pray in a second. Just go around your groups, maybe designate one person that's going to be able to pray for you, but just talk about what's going on in your lives, maybe have a moment of just connection. But before we go, I want to thank you for being here, and I want you to recognize with me that this kind of stuff, the Bible, is our foundation. It is our foundation. It is our lens for viewing the rest of reality around us. And if we have that lens all the time, that's going to help us understand the bad lenses that are thrown our way. Whenever someone who talks from an atheist perspective or a Hindu perspective or just some other perspective that is totally abiblical, we'll be able to actually understand what we've learned, what we hold in our heart, and what's written in our scriptures, and understand what the actual reality is. You're the person who's actually looking at the screen, and you're seeing the truth of whether it's Iron Man, Spider-Man, whatever, because you have the right person to identify it behind you. But go ahead and do that now. I'm going to pray for us just as a group, but then in your own small groups, go ahead and pray for each other. Heavenly Father, God, thank you for this time you've given us. Thank you for your word, which is altogether trustworthy and true. We thank you for this Messiah, which you've sent into this world to suffer for our sake, Lord. I pray for the coming weeks as we learn more about him and how we relate to him, God, and our destiny and the destiny of everything. We trust you. We trust you are sovereign in control of everything. And I pray, bless our conversation and future prayers as we devote ourselves to you. I pray this in the name of the Son and by the Spirit.